Good morning, everyone, and thank you for tuning in. Welcome to King Tide Live, brought to you by Boston Harbor Now in partnership with UMass Boston School for the Environment, the National Parks of Boston, and Harborkeepers. My name is Aaron Toffler, and I'm the Policy Director at Boston Harbor Now. For those of you who are joining for the first time, king tides are a naturally occurring phenomenon that happen occasionally after a new or full moon. We track them in Boston Harbor when the tide is over 12 feet. A normal high tide is about 10 feet. Though they aren't directly linked to sea level rise, these extreme tides give us a unique glimpse of how shorelines will be impacted by sea level rise and climate change in the near future. If you want to see what flooding could look like in the future on a map, you can visit the Climate Ready Boston Map Explorer shown here. But today, we're going to show you what these king tides are doing right now. We'll go to Morrissey Blvd in Dorchester, Long Wharf in the downtown Boston area, Belle Marsh in East Boston, and Ryan Playground in Charlestown. On a normal day, when the tide is low, these shorelines look like this. If you have any questions, please feel free to send them in via Zoom or Facebook, as we'll be monitoring both as we go along. And now for our first stop today, we'll head to Morrissey Blvd in Dorchester, where our partner at UMass Boston and the Stone Living Lab, Professor Robert Chen, will show us the conditions. Bob?
Thank you, Aaron. And can't get my video. Someone has to turn on my video for a second. So here we are at Morrissey Blvd, and we see what's normally dry is quite wet here on a very nice non-stormy day. The cars are limited to one lane and in both directions, and are running through salt water that is really getting their undercarriage quite wet and potentially rusty. This is Morrissey Blvd, which is a fill of a naturally open harbor, naturally open bay. And it does flood at the high tides every sort of spring tide, every 2 weeks of the full moon and the new moon. But this is the king tide, which is especially high with the sun and moon helping out. This is just an astronomically high tide, which means that it's predictable and natural. But we luckily have good weather, a high pressure area, and the wind is pushing the water offshore. If we had a low pressure zone, a storm like a nor'easter or a Sandy, we could have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 feet higher water at the same time. And so this is a prediction of what might happen every month in the coming years. And with sea level rise, storm surge, in addition to the astronomical high tides, Morrissey Blvd will be under water like this quite often. I'm going to try to take a look here. My name is Bob Chen. I'm a professor of oceanography and the Interim Dean in the School for the Environment. And I'm here, this is my daily commute coming on to Morrissey Blvd to work. And I know that given these high tides, these wicked high tides, it'll be very difficult to get into UMass Boston via Morrissey Blvd. So there are plans to raise this area about 12 feet higher than the current height. That is going to be a major construction issue. I'm part of a new project called the Stone Living Lab, partnership between the Boston Harbor Now, the National Park of Boston Harbor Islands, UMass Boston, the Stone Foundation, City of Boston. And we're trying to figure out how to best do some of the adaptations, the protection of this flooding. How do we build something of higher elevation that is not just a seawall, but that has multiple co-benefits, meaning that it has recreational, educational aspects, as well as ecological benefits, such as providing nursery habitat or sucking some of the CO2 out of the air, being productive systems like salt marsh grasses. So we're going to be experimenting with a number of areas in the Boston Harbor to try to think about when this type of high tide is common, how are we going to adapt as a city in the best possible ways for the future generations? Thank you, Aaron, and back to you.
Thanks, Bob. Next, we're going to head to downtown Boston's Long Wharf, the gateway to the Boston Harbor Islands National and State Park, where National Park Service naturalist Laura Yates will show us what things look like during this high tide in a highly trafficked tourist area downtown. Laura?
Thanks, Aaron. Hi, everyone. My name is Laura. I'm a biological science technician with the Boston Harbor Islands National and State Park. And as Aaron said, I'm down here at Long Wharf. I'm going to flip my camera so I can show you. So as you can see, the water has risen quite dramatically. If you look over here, you can see that it's even crested the bottom stair right there. And this ramp over here too, water is flooded about halfway up. So I'm standing here at Long Wharf, which is the gateway to the Boston Harbor Islands National and State Park. You can even see some of the islands out there. Although I can't be out on the islands to show you how king tides look, I'm standing here to show you from this perspective. Long Wharf happens to be a historical dock from the 18th century and an important hub for passenger ferries and sightseeing boats. As you can see, it is underwater. Just as we have infrastructure concerns with flooding in this area, high flooding events impact natural resources on the islands. So as Professor Chen said, king tides are normal, naturally occurring events. Our last time daytime king flood happened in October on a really calm, placid day. And I was working on Grape Island personally and didn't experience much flooding too far beyond the high tide line. But when extreme high tides like this one are combined with sea level rise and storm surge, which is the rise in seawater level caused by a storm, they do have the potential to cause flooding events both here in Boston and on the Boston Harbor Islands. So how does such flooding impact the ecosystems on the Boston Harbor Islands? So let's start by talking about how flooding impacts plants. Not many plants around here, but we do care a lot about them on the Boston Harbor Islands. It's safe to say that the plants living on the islands are accustomed to a degree of exposure from salt spray. However, many of the plants can't survive complete saltwater inundation that may occur with increased flooding brought on by sea level rise, storm surge, and exceptionally high tides. High concentration of salt in the soil can actually draw water out of plant roots, essentially dehydrating the plant. Certain plant roots, when exposed to salt water, may even activate a stress hormone to stop root growth. Plant roots may also uptake the molecules that make up salt, displacing absorption of other minerals that the plant needs to survive. This summer, for example, I worked on a team to plant many native plants on Thompson Island, and it flooded in a certain area where we had planted, and the plants didn't survive that event. So how else does flooding impact the Boston Harbor Islands? Our coastlines are also vulnerable to erosion, again, a natural process, but one exacerbated by storm surge, sea level rise in conjunction with these high tides. For example, the islands provide valuable habitat for numerous species of nesting shorebirds, including least terns and oyster catchers. If we lose the shoreline, we consequently lose habitat for these birds and other organisms. Natural resources aren't the only resources on the islands that are vulnerable to flooding. We also have archaeological resources, including military forts and relics and graveyards out there. So how do we enhance the climate resiliency of the Boston Harbor Islands? Converting space to salt marshes and protecting existing salt marshes is a great start, both on the islands and on the mainland. Salt marshes have numerous benefits, including acting as buffers to absorb tidal energy and reduce storm impact. When you are deciding what native plants to plant in your backyard and are concerned with coastal flooding, the Massachusetts Office of Coastal Zone Management has a list of recommended plants available on their website, including marsh elder, sea lavender, and Virginia rose. So next we'll go to Belle Isle Marsh, which is Boston's last remaining salt marsh. And thank you very much for joining me.
Thanks, Laura. That is a great segue to our next on-site reporter. We're going to head over now to East Boston, where Magdalena from the group Harborkeepers will show us what flooding looks like at Belle Marsh. Magdalena?
Thank you so much, Aaron. I'm really happy to be here. Hope you can all hear me well. My name is Magdalena, and I represent the Harborkeepers. We are a local organization that does climate resiliency and coastal education. And we are here. I'm going to flip my camera. I just wanted to say hi to everyone. So we are here at the Belle Marsh, and what I'm showing you here is this is essentially, you can see the sign entering Boston. This is the boundary line between Boston and Revere. And why this place is so critical is if you look at the essentially the rack line, the water line here, right? It is quite close to the street. I've seen this actually flow into the street where it's completely blocked. And this is a really critical area because, as Laura was saying, this is the last remaining salt marsh in Boston. The Belle Marsh is really critical to, essentially to climate resiliency in the city of Boston, and to make sure that, this is essentially the first line of defense. When we talk about coastal wetlands, it is, the vegetation that's absorbing all of the salt water and essentially protecting not just coastal communities, but really habitat, as Laura was mentioning, from flooding. So you can see here, if you look at the cars go by, right, like this is a problem in terms of, for coastal communities, because this is actually an evacuation route. So there is a big risk here. There's a vulnerability that we need to address as a city. But you can see right now, the water is not on the street, but in the nor'easters of 2018, this was blocked. This was flooded. They had to block the road. You couldn't traverse here. So it's a big problem. And I want to show you here this grate. The water will actually come right up through the grate and then just basically topple over into the street. We are lucky today, as Aaron was saying, it's a beautiful day. As Professor Chen was saying, it's a beautiful sunny day. So this wicked high tide, astronomical high tide, is not the worst that we've seen, but it is sort of a window into the future and why we should be concerned. Again, the Belle Marsh is the last remaining salt marsh. It's critical habitat to protect, not just marine species or wildlife, but really these communities over here. And with the build out of Suffolk Downs, we are very concerned about the inability for the salt marsh to do landward migration. So it's a big concern, very vulnerable area, and documenting the high tides here, especially the wicked high tides, are really critical to understanding, scenarios and projections in the future and how we're going to adapt as coastal communities. So just taking a good look here. You can always tell how high the water goes by looking at, the basically along the shoreline, the clues of where the water reached the rack lines. And if you looked at the picture that Aaron showed you earlier, this here wouldn't be all water. There would be marshes here, marsh vegetation. So thank you for tuning in. And I guess I'll pass it on to, who's next?
I'll take it, Magdalena. Thank you so much.
Sure.
We're now going to go over to Charlestown, where Boston Harbor Now's Alice Brown is standing by, and she's going to show us the conditions under the Moakley Bridge. Alice?
Hi, Aaron. Not under the Moakley Bridge. I'm out by the Shaft Center in Charlestown by Ryan Playground.
Yes.
And saying hi, I'm going to turn you around so you can see where we are. This is a part of the harbor that I'm going to assume that a lot of people don't visit regularly. Here we go. But for orientation, there is the Tobin Bridge. And fun fact, the thing next to that's just sort of floating out here is Anthony's Pier 4. It's just like they took the building and put it on a dock. But what I actually want to show you is a little bit of the shoreline back here. So while we are on the Mystic River, we are in the tidal part of the Mystic River. The Amelia Earhart Dam is north of me, and I'll show you that direction in a minute. And that's where the purely riverine water is meeting with the salt water of the high tide. You'll see if I can zoom in, yes, that there is flooding taking place on a part of the harbor walk over there. Charlestown, and it does flood with some regularity. Back out and bring you around, you'll see that I'm standing on a pier. There's about a few feet left of room for high. There are two floats and ramp systems off of it, and they're a little bit distorted. This space here is due to the fact that the ramp is pulling the float. It's not designed to go this high, so the floats are stuck twisting in a weird way. So that's not something you want to sustain over a long period of time. This way to the Shraps line, you can see from the roundabout at the Shraps, by the Shraps Center. And over here is Ryan Playground. If you check out the plan for Climate Ready Charlestown on the City of Boston's website, you'll see that the Ryan Playground, while it does have some room for sea level rise to get a little higher along the shoreline, again, like Bob was describing, in the event of a major storm at a tide like this, the water just comes up and over into this area. And while this edge is actually high enough to be ready, the elevation of the grassy areas behind it is a little bit lower. They hold a lot of the rainwater, like the water we got last night, and then they also hold any sea level, any storm surge and salt water that comes up over it. And those fields are not designed to be ready for that. This is the Alfred Street Bridge, and I'm not gonna, well, I guess I can try to zoom in. If we zoom in under the Alfred Street Bridge and I find a way to point, there's a seawall back there by the MBTA logo. That seawall was recently constructed because there was historic flooding that took place regularly there. And they've actually rebuilt that seawall because they recognized that it wasn't prepared. It was degrading and it was occasionally causing flooding. So that seawall, the MBTA has invested in over this year. And there will be a community path that connects from this area of the city all the way up to Assembly Row. You can see the taller buildings of Assembly Row there. So this is a place that isn't right now flooding every day at high tide, except for that piece of Harbor Walk, but it is at risk in the future, and it's a big risk for the storm. And this, all of Ryan Playground area leads to one of the flood pathways into Charlestown that will really start to block infrastructure and create other problems around Sullivan Square and that roundabout. And we won't call it a train station for a while, but it's that pathway that they're trying to protect. And I'll turn it back to you, Aaron.
Great, thanks, Alice. Just a reminder, if you're tuning in live, we're going to pivot now to answering some of your questions, which you can submit either using the Q&A feature in Zoom or leave a comment on Facebook if you're watching there. For right now, I think we have one question that came in when Bob, you were speaking, and somebody asks, is the water coming through the storm drain or directly from the shoreline? So can we get back to you to answer that one?
Yeah, sorry, so windy. Right now the water is coming through the storm drains. There's about 3 of them coming up on both sides of the street, but it's about 2 and 3 inches from coming over the top of the sidewalk, which is the high point to the road. So I think we might have just barely escaped it this time, but oftentimes it comes over directly over from the water as well.
Great. Thank you. Any other questions? Again, I'll remind you, okay. We have one question that I think I'm going to direct to Alice, if that's all right, sort of a question about the seaport. Why was the seaport allowed to be developed, and what are the steps being taken to deal with flooding in that area, and who is paying for it?
Thanks for that question, Nancy. The seaport was part of a master plan that the city did back in the 1990s. Parts of it are at risk to flooding, other parts are not. And the city of Boston released a climate ready plan for the South Boston Seaport area that includes strategies to provide defense against a variety of different flood entryways. If developers are able to coordinate their plans along the waterfront in sections. They can build one continuous line of defense. And they're working with the city as well as, you know, adjacent property owners on that. Some parts of the seaport are owned by Mass Port, and they're also working on climate resilience plans. And then along the Fort Point Channel, the BPDA is doing plans for both open space and a resilient berm that will also protect that part of the district. As you may know, there are parts of the seaport that are very historic, like the Fort Point district, which has lots of old brick warehouses, and there's a lot of work that's being done to protect and preserve those buildings as well.
Thanks, Alice. A general question that could probably be handled by any of our reporters, as I think it touches on each of these areas. What are some of the implications for public transit in Boston in king tide and climate change related sea level rise? So whomever, Alice, do you want to start with that? And then Magdalena or Bob, if you want to chime in, that would be great too.
Sure. So the blue line is obviously one of the places that's at risk to sea level rise insofar as it runs under Long Wharf. And Long Wharf is, as our NPS reporter Laura noted, a historic structure. And so the water can come in there through a variety of places. While they sandbag the entry points, there are many, many other areas where different conduits and pipes can lead to potential flooding. But the MBTA is working on plans to address each of those issues, and that will be ongoing. I don't know if, actually I should, but don't know if there are bus routes that go up and down Morrissey Boulevard that might be impacted by flooding there. And Magdalena may be able to speak more to potential flooding areas in East Boston.
Yeah, so I mean, from the East Boston perspective, I mean, you know, essentially we were a series of 5 islands, right? And it was filled in, and you know, East Boston is particularly vulnerable because we're isolated and we became this big island. And the only way we can get in and out is really through tunnels or the bridge, or through this connection here where I was showing you each line out to here. So there is a big concern about. The blue line is actually, you know, considered to be one of the newest, you know, portions of the T. Yes, as you said, Alice, they are actively, the MBTA is actively pursuing some really robust climate plans. So, you know, this is obviously a huge issue of resiliency planning for the city that is being addressed. But, you know, it's a big concern in terms of redundant modes of transportation, especially during storms and, you know, huge they might hit one of those, and we have to have redundant systems to be able to transport in and out, you know, for evacuation. So yeah, it's a big concern that, you know, the agencies are addressing this issue, and as advocates, we just got to continue to create awareness and stay engaged in the planning, the resilience planning. Thank you.
Thanks, Magdalena. It's obviously super windy out there. I hope that, Andrew, you were able to hear that answer, and others. At the moment, I don't see any other questions, so I will give a couple of seconds for those, for more questions to come in. But in the meantime, I will say we do encourage you to share what the king tide looks like in your neighborhood. Share your photos with My Coast Massachusetts, a portal for the Massachusetts Office of Coastal Zone Management to collect and analyze pictures and data relating to coastal events. And we have the link up on the screen now. You can visit mycoast.org/mass/king tides to share your pictures. And even after that short plug, I don't see any further questions. So I am going to thank everyone for joining us today. Thanks to all of our reporters for braving the elements and for bringing us this information, and have a great rest of your afternoon, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, y'all.